Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannadi Jordan, Communications Associate at the Bipartisan Policy Center. This week, we're going to spend some time catching up on the latest immigration news as of this recording on February 22nd, from the Supreme Court's removal of Title 42 from their argument calendar to the reintroduction of the DREAM Act. We have a full episode for you today, so stay tuned. Welcome back. In this episode, we're covering recent issues in immigration news, including the Supreme Court's decision to drop Title 42 from their calendar, the latest numbers at the border, Biden's State of the Union address, and more. Joining us for this analysis is This Week in Immigration regular Theresa Cardinal Brown. Welcome back, Theresa.
Happy to be here, Hannadi.
Well, Theresa, last week, the Supreme Court took down the Title 42 case from their scheduled arguments. And Title 42 is set to expire on May 11th when the Biden administration lifts the public health emergency put in place during COVID. Firstly, can you explain how the national COVID-19 public health emergency and the Title 42 border policy are tied together?
Sure. So, as we've described previously on this podcast, Title 42 refers to the body of public health law in the United States, and it covers all kinds of things related to the Public Health Service, Health and Human Services, and their activities. But when we talk about Title 42 in the immigration context, we're talking about an order issued by the director of the Centers for Disease Control in March 2020 that said that it would prohibit the entry of people across the border who didn't have documents to prevent the spread of COVID in congregate settings in immigration facilities along the border. So in the immigration context, Title 42 refers to that order. And the order has been updated several times since it was first issued in March 2020 under the Trump administration. The latest version was issued last year under the Biden administration. But the latest version explicitly says that the Title 42 immigration order, the CDC order, will expire when the public health emergency for COVID-19 is taken down. So public health emergency, just like a national disaster emergency, is a presidential declaration that frees up authorities and money to handle whatever the emergency is. In this case, the public health emergency allowed for the government to expedite and authorize vaccines for COVID. It authorized testing for COVID and bought tests for the public. If you remember, we could ask the post office to deliver us free tests to our home. All of that was money and authorities that were freed up under the public health emergency for COVID. So the public health emergency is much broader than the border order, but the border order is part of the public health emergency for COVID. So, even though the order has been primarily used to address migration at the U.S.-Mexico border, it is, as a legal matter, tied to this public health emergency for COVID.
So once the administration can no longer use the public health order to manage migration, what can we expect after the fall of Title 42 in terms of immigration at the border?
So we've seen and heard from the Biden administration, from the Secretary of Homeland Security in various documents and testimonies and other things, the outlines of what we think they will be doing. And they've also filed some notices in other court cases related to Title 42 that have told us what they're intending to do. So predominantly, and because they don't have other authorities, they will rely on Title 8, which is the body of immigration law, to process people. So we'd be essentially kind of winding back the clock a little bit to before March of 2020. But certain programs under the immigration authority that the Trump administration used, for example, the Biden administration is not planning to use, one of which is the so-called Remain in Mexico policy or migrant protection protocols. The Biden administration took down that program. The Supreme Court let them take it down, and the Biden administration will not be going back to that policy as we understand it right now. However, They will be relying on authorities called expedited removal, which says that if you arrive between a port of entry, we can remove you or deport you back to your country if you don't have another reason to stay in the United States without sending you to immigration court. The exception to that is if you claim fear of returning and therefore want to file an asylum claim. So the asylum provisions and expedited removal provisions work together. So if somebody says, "Oh, you don't deport me because I'm afraid of going home, I could be persecuted," then by law they have to be given an interview to decide if they're eligible to apply for asylum. That process is going to be expedited at the border. The Biden administration has also put forward just in this last week a new proposed regulation that would explicitly say you're not eligible for asylum if you come to the border with and have passed through other countries and haven't applied there. Now, this is controversial because there was a similar regulation that the Trump administration put in place that they were sued over and it was taken down. But we believe these are the major tools. Additionally, the programs of parole that they have created for Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Cubans and Haitians, they will be continuing. And this ability to apply at a port of entry for an asylum interview through an app that they have called the CBP One app. But we believe those are the major tools they'll be using.
With all of the mechanisms you just mentioned that the Biden administration is planning to employ or has already employed in advance of Title 42's fall, will these help mitigate some of the effects we're expecting to see after Title 42 goes away?
I think that remains to be seen. You know, the capacity of the infrastructure and personnel that we have to conduct these interviews in a timely manner at Border Patrol facilities, the numbers of arrivals will matter. If they overwhelm the facilities, they overwhelm the facilities, and then CBP is going to have to start removing them. The administration is relying heavily on deterrence, frankly. This asylum regulation, which they hope to have in final form and in place by May 11th, when this all comes down, when Title 42 comes down, essentially would deny the ability to ask for asylum to many, if not most, of the people who arrive at the border. And in the regulation, they're explicit about hoping that that would deter people from coming to the border. Now, asylum advocates and others have said that it's illegal. The same groups that sued the Trump administration over their similar regulation have already said they intend to sue the Biden administration over this regulation. So it's unclear whether it will stay in place. And I think part of the issue is that we are not doing what we need to do to address the capacity of our border infrastructure and our asylum and adjudicative systems to handle the large numbers of arrivals that we're seeing. And we keep trying things to reduce the number of arrivals, and there's been no policy that I think has had a lasting impact at doing that.
Well, one policy that we just talked about, which was the expanded use of parole, which would admit 30,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans per month, it seems to be a real sticking point for many Republicans, with some calling the move unlawful, as you mentioned, and a lawsuit led by Texas filed against it. What are the consequences if this policy were to be struck down in the courts, and how would this impact our regional cooperation efforts with Mexico?
So it would have some pretty big effects, but in part because the Biden administration has pinned an awful lot of its border management strategy, both in the short term and the long term, on this idea of being able to use parole for specific populations. So when we are speaking of the Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans in particular, before these parole programs were put in place, the challenge was that we could not deport people back to those countries because we didn't have diplomatic relations with them. And Mexico would not allow us to send them back to Mexico under Title 42. So by default, the only thing we could do was release them into the country to pursue asylum claims inside the country. And that encouraged many, many more to come. So the numbers last year in these of these nationalities were very, very high, higher than almost any other nationality except Mexico. So since those parole programs were put in place, the corollary to the parole program was if you didn't come via the parole program, we would send you back to Mexico under Title 42. If the parole programs go away, chances are Mexico would say, we're not going to take people back because that was their requirement. They would only take people back if these other parole avenues were opened up. So if Mexico says we can't take people back and we can't parole them, then we're back to where we were last year when people were arriving. We would have no choice but to release them into the country to pursue asylum claims. So, the challenge with this program and with, frankly, the proposed ideas that the Biden administration wants to do with asylum, as I've already mentioned, is litigation. And that is an issue that has dogged every administration since President Obama. Whenever they have tried to put in place, I, you know, processes or policies under what they believe are their authorities under law to try to deal with the migration at the border, one side or the other that says either these policies are too strict or they're not strict enough is suing in court, finding judges that will issue an injunction to stop them from implementing the policies. And so every time that happens, the tools available to the administration to really manage what's happening at the border are further limited.
You mentioned we've seen less arrivals of migrants from those 4 countries since the parole program was enacted. And the U.S. Border Patrol reported in January the lowest levels of encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border since February 2021, with more than 128,000 apprehensions. This number is down from about 42% from the previous month. So what's contributing to the reduced number of crossings?
Well, if you ask the administration, it's the parole program and the fact that people are being sent back to Mexico under Title 42. I am holding judgment on whether or not that's the case. I think it's too soon. These parole programs, other than for Venezuela, have only been in effect for just over a month and a half. And, this time of year, December through February, tends to be winter months, colder. That part of the U.S.-Mexico border region has had much, much colder weather, including ice storms and snowstorms and below freezing temperatures several times this winter. And that could be a deterrent to people crossing. We also think that there may just be a generalized pause of migrants trying to figure out, okay, what does this new thing mean? And can I take advantage of it or not? And, we've seen that with other policies that are put in place. There seems to be a temporary slowdown, but it hasn't lasted really for longer than several months. Then you see migration shifting to other parts of the border, people trying other ways to come in. We're already seeing certain Venezuelans and Nicaraguans who are arriving in cities in the United States who have not turned themselves in to Border Patrol, who have snuck around. So we could see more of that. I think it's too soon for us to say whether these will have any lasting effect. And again, with Title 42 going away, even if we're going to use expedited removal, will Mexico take people back who are formally deported rather than being expelled under Title 42? And I think that's an issue that is being negotiated between the countries right now.
So the long-term effects still remain to be seen. Biden administration can't do a victory lap just yet. But something I want to dive a little bit deeper into is the parole program itself. So this allows migrants who come into the country under these programs to stay and work in the U.S. while they seek a more permanent status, like asylum. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and what happens after the 2-year parole period ends?
So this is sort of the enticement for people to use the program. So to qualify for parole, you have to be applying not at the border. You have to be either in your country of origin or have temporarily in a different country. But you can't be at the border or on your way to the border. You have to have a sponsor in the United States. So whether or not that's a person who's known to you or a non-governmental organization or a church group or anybody anybody in the United States can sponsor somebody through these parole programs. They just go online to USCIS and say, I'd like to sponsor somebody, and they answer some questions, and they have to be willing to sponsor them financially for a period of time, as well as, vouch for them and help them settle in the United States. But you're right, it does give people a lawful admission for 2 years and work authorization that they can get almost immediately, which is different than those that have previously come to the border and been released. They're not eligible to get work authorization until they've filed their asylum claim and then for some period of time after that. So at the very least, it allows people to sustain themselves while they're waiting to see what happens. However, they're not in deportation proceedings, so they have to initiate an asylum claim on their own with USCIS or find another status that they might be able to get after their parole period ends. We have not heard anything from the administration about whether people would be able to apply to extend their parole if they run out of time at the end of 2 years and are not able to file for asylum or find another way to stay in the United States, or if at that point they'd be deportable, and then what happens, right? We don't know any of this because the programs are too new. But we have some ideas from what we've seen from, for example, the Afghan parolees who were brought in after the Afghan evacuation. Many of them are running out of their parole status now, and it's unclear that USCIS will extend them, and they haven't been able to necessarily apply for asylum or special immigrant visas or other status. And that's one of the reasons why their supporters are pushing for Congress to pass a law that would allow them to adjust status to get green cards. So I think that's one of the challenges of these kind of parole programs. It's sort of punting on the issue of what happens to these people later. We don't know. We will have to see. And so I think that's part of the challenge of that. I think the other thing is that, we don't know who all can apply for this. One of the things we are seeing is and hearing about now is that many migrants who maybe don't know people in the United States are falling prey to scammers on the internet who are saying, I'm willing to sponsor a Cuban or a Venezuelan, send me $3,000 and I'll put in the sponsorship application money. And then they never do. And, it's unclear what all the government can do to kind of forestall some of that because it's happening to people who are outside the United States. Certainly, if somebody files a fraudulent sponsorship claim, they could be subject to penalties, but this kind of fraudulent activity, it's harder for the government to control, but it just tells you how desperate migrants are.
Well, key element of the parole program that you touched on was the fact that to come to the US, these migrants require sponsors in the US. And some have argued that this policy favors wealthier asylum seekers or those with familial connections in the US. How could this policy better serve those most in need of asylum?
Well, as you mentioned, that's the challenge, right? Those most in need of asylum, one, are probably already have left their country or are trying very hard to get out. The idea of staying in their country until they can make this happen may not be viable for somebody who's actually at risk of persecution or torture in their home country. I think we need to understand that. I think, secondly, as you mentioned, if you don't already know somebody in the United States who can sponsor you, then you're kind of at the mercy of either generous people in the United States who are willing to take in anybody and sponsor anybody from that country, not knowing who they are, and matching process that certain NGOs are trying to happen, or you could be susceptible, as I mentioned, to some fraudulent actors. The other thing is that in order to take advantage of this, if you're granted parole, you fly into the United States. You're not allowed to show up at the border, which means you have to have the means with which to buy an airline ticket. You have to have a passport. And again, people who have fled their country may or may not have a passport from their country. So that may be an impediment to being able to use these programs. So if you think about what a true person who would qualify for asylum is facing, right? You qualify for asylum if you have been persecuted or fear that you have a well-founded fear that you will be persecuted on account of one of the criteria: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Persecution is a pretty serious thing, and if you are at risk of persecution, particularly from your government, and you don't already have the means to travel, getting the means to travel from your government may be an impossibility. And I think that's where asylum advocates have trouble with this parole in lieu of asylum. It can help some people, it certainly can, but it may leave some of those who are most in need of protection outside the ability to gain it.
Thank you, Theresa, for that overview. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back to talk about the State of the Union and border legislation in Congress. Don't go away. And we're back. Theresa, on February 8th, Biden gave his third State of the Union address. He didn't spend a lot of time on immigration, but he did touch on a couple key issues and called on Congress to take action to address the problems we're seeing at the border. What issues around border control is Congress currently looking at, and do you anticipate any movement on the issue?
Well, we know that many Republicans ran for Congress in the last election, promising to hold the Biden administration accountable for what's happening at the border, that they promised to crack down at the border and be more forceful in securing the border. And I think that's what we're seeing, particularly from Republicans in the House. So as we talked about in one of the earlier episodes this year, Speaker McCarthy did make some promises to certain members of his conference to gain the speaker votes needed after 14 tries. One of which was that he would move a border security bill to the floor fairly quickly. And so there have been several border security bills introduced. One in particular by Representative Chip Roy of Texas was the one that was supposed to go to the floor, but they've not been able to move it due to some internal conflicts. Aside from that, Republicans, as soon as they got their committees set up, started holding hearings on the border. And we have seen hearings not just in the expected committees like the Judiciary and the Homeland Security Committee, but the Energy and Commerce Committee has an oversight subcommittee that also held a hearing at the border. So it seems like every committee that has a plausible oversight authority to cover some aspect of the border is going to do something at the border. And so we're going to see a lot of that. But in terms of like actual solutions, I think that's the challenge. I don't think there's agreement among Republicans, much less between Republicans and Democrats or the president, on what the right answers for the border are. And I think that's what's playing out right now.
Well, in his speech, Biden called on Congress to pass his comprehensive immigration plan. Can you tell us what the difference between the comprehensive immigration plan is compared to his plan to provide equipment and officers to secure the border?
Yeah, this was something that I think surprised a lot of immigration advocates for sure, is that he said, well, Congress, please pass my comprehensive immigration bill. If you can't at least pass, funding for more Border Patrol agents and technology at the border, which made it sound to many advocates that he was saying, I understand you're not going to give me comprehensive immigration reform, but let's beef up the border together. And then he followed that after a pause with, oh, and dreamers and TPS holders and other undocumented. So it may have been just how he, ad libbed in that second. Who knows what was in his actual speech, if that was how it was meant to come out. But I think to people that were hoping that he would be very sort of specific about what he was hoping Congress would do, it was a little kind of all over the place. The issue with his comprehensive immigration plan, if you go back to after he was inaugurated in 2021, one of the very first bills that his administration with Democrats in Congress introduced was the U.S. Citizenship Act. And the primary piece of that was legalization for almost all of the undocumented in the United States. It did have some border provisions and some legal immigration provisions, but the bulk of it was about legalization. And I think the challenge is that certainly Republicans in the House have ruled out any form of legalization, what they call amnesty, in this Congress until, as they say, the border is secure. So I think that that's unlikely to happen. But I also think that it's not really an answer to what Republicans are asking for, which is a viable plan to manage what's happening at the border. And I think even some Democrats are coming around to seeing that need. I mean, we already saw a bipartisan group of senators travel down to the US Mexico border to El Paso. We talked to El Paso County Commissioner David Stout about that. They're looking for solutions. And I think that they understand this is something that has to be managed better than it is. But if you're an immigration person like I am, you waited a long time to hear the word immigration pop up in that State of the Union speech, and afterwards you kind of went, eh. I don't think it was a definitive call to action. It certainly didn't like generate huge clapping moments from Democrats, and Republicans weren't all that psyched about it either. So I don't think it's moved the needle much at all, frankly.
So all around wasn't a hit on both sides. But returning to something you just mentioned about Republicans introducing legislation and taking this really hardline focus on immigration now that they have control of the House. Representative Chip Roy introduced the Border Safety and Security Act of 2023. Can you tell us what this proposed legislation would do and how it would impact asylum seekers?
So HR 29, this bill is all of 3 pages long. So if you think about, how detailed it is and lots of, provisions that would affect migration, it's not. It's almost too simplistic, is how I would evaluate it. It says that the Secretary of Homeland Security must either send every migrant that arrives into detention in the United States to wait on a hearing to decide if they can get an asylum, or send them back to Mexico. And that's the only choices. And the challenge there is operationally, Congress has never, ever, ever funded sufficient detention space to hold even the lowest number of migrants that we had seen in, say, the early 2010s, when annual arrivals at the US Mexico border were around 300 to 400,000. At most, Congress has ever funded between 30 and 40,000 detention beds in this country. So there's a big disconnect there. And I don't think that there's any possibility that Congress, this Congress or a future Congress, would fund enough detention space for all of those people. Secondly, the insistence that we would send them back to Mexico if we can't detain them presupposes that Mexico would be happy to take back anybody we send. And we have seen Mexico has conditions. Unless you're Mexican, they don't have to take you back. And if they're going to take people back, they have conditions. And one of their conditions, particularly as we talked about with Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians, is that the US provided other legal avenues for them to arrive. So this bill would not provide any of those avenues. So I think it's, from an immigration analyst perspective, it's not a realistic border bill. It sounds tough. It sounds very tough, but it's not really practical. It's not implementable the way it's written. And I think that that is one of the reasons it's hit some stumbling blocks.
So the bill is kind of creating an impossible task for the Secretary of Homeland Security to fulfill. We know that it hasn't hit the floor yet, and it has sparked an interesting battle within the GOP on immigration issues. Can you talk about what that dispute is, and do you see a clear path forward for action on the border?
So almost immediately after the bill was introduced, Republican Tony Gonzalez of Texas, whose district has the most linear miles of the US Mexico border of any congressional district in the United States, came out very hard against the bill. And not only because he said it was unrealistic, but he said it would completely shut down the ability of anybody to apply for asylum in the United States. And for Gonzalez, he said that's anti American. We have always been a place that people can seek protection. And maybe we need better ways to do it, but we need to figure out how to do this without shutting down asylum completely. And he was very public with these criticisms. He was public on social media. He wrote an op ed in the paper. And it was kind of a surprising, very public stance against another member of his conference, a very strong stance against another member of his conference. And he indicated there were other members that also had concerns. I think he was probably the most public. There were some other members who said, well, maybe this should go through committee, maybe going straight to the floor is not the best answer. In any case, the leadership figured out that there were enough Republicans who would not vote for the bill, that they didn't have enough votes to pass it if it came to the floor. And at the end of the day, leadership hates putting a bill on the floor that can't pass. So they yanked it. And it is apparently going to go through some markups in Judiciary and Homeland Security Committee. It might be merged with other bills that are out there. It might have other provisions added. We don't know how this is going to play out. But it just goes to show that, statements of harsh border policies not only may not be effective in a practical sense, even if they were to be made into law, but are running into some political headwinds as well. And let's remember, Republicans do not have a very large majority. 3 or 4 votes is enough to take down any bill. And I think we're seeing the effects of that with this border bill.
Well, one other bill that was introduced, or reintroduced, should I say, is the DREAM Act. And that would allow non citizens without lawful status, brought here as children, who meet certain education or work requirements to earn lawful permanent residence. It was reintroduced by Senators Dick Durbin of Illinois and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. And notably, a version of this bill has been introduced in every Congress since 2000. I think this is the third time that both senators have introduced the bill. And Senator Durbin noted DACA hangs by a thread. Only Congress can give them, dreamers, stability. So, what challenge does this legislation face getting across the finish line?
So, as you mentioned, the Republican co-sponsor is Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He has been the co-sponsor on 3 versions of this bill, so for at least 6 years. I think he is somebody that also very much recognizes where the Republican conference is and the challenges in the House. And so he acknowledged when he introduced it, yes, I would love to see the Dreamers get legalization, but I don't see this bill moving unless we can get the border secure. Right. So he's kind of being the little bit of the wet blanket on it, even though he's a sponsor of the bill. But I think he's being realistic. At least right now, certainly the House is not going to take up any dream legislation at all. That was pretty clear what Speaker McCarthy said about any form of amnesty. But I think I think Democrats in the Senate recognize that the border has sort of de facto taken over the discussion on immigration right now. Unfortunately, not because the border is not a very serious problem that needs to be addressed. It is a crisis. I have said that before. I will say it again. It is definitely a crisis, but other things can contribute to helping solving that crisis other than just what we do at the border. And some of that may be about legalization. Some of it may be about reforming our legal immigration system to create other pathways for people to come who maybe couldn't qualify for asylum, but would, help us with labor shortages in various areas of our country. I think we need to revisit the idea that there's kind of separate answers for all of these pieces of the immigration system when it is in fact a system. And we know that when you tweak one part of a system, it has corollary effects on the other parts, both positive and negative. And so I think we kind of need to recognize that a little bit politically. I know that's a hard sell, but realistically, I think we need to understand that these things are related.
Is that something you feel members of Congress are beginning to understand as related? I know that you said that the border is sort of dominating the immigration conversation, but does this legislation impact the conversation?
I think there's been certainly a belief that there could be a winning strategy that would marry DREAM Act or DACA legislation with border legislation. I think that was a political calculus in the last Congress. I think there are people that still believe that is a potential political way forward in this Congress. But I think, the DREAM Act or some form of the DREAM Act has been introduced 20 years. The policies around what that would look like are kind of pretty well known. Like, there are different formulations of who would qualify and how they would qualify and how long it would take to get permanent residence and things like that. But in general, I think everyone kind of knows what the policy landscape to deal with dreamers and DACA recipients looks like. I think the policy answers for the border are still kind of unknown. And so until we have sort of if not a consensus, sort of a narrowing of what the realistic answers for the border are to have that conversation with Dream, I think it's going to be a little while. I mean, we saw that at the end of last Congress when the Cinema and Tillis efforts didn't bear fruit, right? Because they didn't really know what the right solutions were for the border, and trying to pair that with DACA just ran out of time. So I think there's more to happen here before we can know whether or not this has a chance of moving forward. Clearly, everybody that has been talking about trying to move this for a lot of years is still talking about it and would like to see it done. We just have to find what's the right political and policy path forward, and I think that's still up in the air.
Theresa, thank you so much for providing all of that insight and catching us up on the news. And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. For feedback or questions, you can contact us by emailing immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hanadi Jordan, Natalie Butler, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Our audio editor is Joshua Joe. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.